There is no shortage of examples throughout history of good leadership and bad leadership. Herod the Great, the one who was ruling when Jesus was born, is example number one of a bad leader. As Jerry read earlier, Herod was egotistical, insecure, threatened by anyone else with any power, in cahoots with the Romans, and completely godless other than the fact that he worshiped himself. It seems obvious that he was a bad leader because he wanted to kill the baby Jesus, and when he couldn't find Jesus, he instead ordered all of the children in Bethlehem and the surrounding area, ages 2 and under, to be slaughtered. What kind of a monster would do such a thing? Jesus escaped death when Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt, and he grew up, and we look to Jesus as the prime example of a good leader. He put others before himself. He included all kinds of different people in his leadership group. He was never violent toward another person. And when one of his followers cut the ear off of a soldier to try to prevent Jesus' arrest, Jesus told them all to put their swords away, and then he healed the soldier. Jesus was not meek and mild, nor was he violent. Jesus spoke truth to power and not for his own gain. For all those reasons, we look to Jesus as a good leader. Some people would say, I am your leader. That would imply that I have authority over you, which makes me smile a little bit, and I find a little humorous. But let's say for a minute that I am your leader. How would you know if I were a bad leader for you? How would you know if I began leading you astray? How would you know if I were slowly becoming a Herod in some way? How would you know if you needed to leave me or if I needed to leave you? What would be the signs? A leader is not a leader without followers. Besides me, I say that with a wink, who are you following? How will you know when someone is no longer someone you want to follow? What are the actions, the traits, the words, the values, or the directions that will signal to you that there needs to be a parting of the ways? The song 50 Ways to Leave a Lover brings to mind that there also ought to be at least 50 ways to leave a leader. When is it time to leave a leader, including those you follow on social media? Bruce Hunt shared a book that he used many years ago in his work, and the book's title is Bad Leadership: What It Is, How It Happens, Why It Matters. And it was written by Harvard professor Barbara Kellerman. In that book, Kellerman argues for why we should study bad leaders, saying that it's a bit naive to think that bad leaders won't happen to us. She examines case studies of some tyrants, some corrupt CEOs, some fallen politicians, and even some cult leaders. She wants more people to be familiar with the traits and types of bad leaders because she does not think they are aberrations, but part and parcel of leadership. The more we understand, the more choice we can exercise about who we are following. In her book, she names 7 distinct categories of bad leadership. Now, they seem obvious, but let's name them: incompetent, rigid, intemperate, callous, corrupt, insular, evil. So, we would think these would be obvious and that no one would follow anyone who exhibits any of those. Why would you choose a leader or follow a leader who is incompetent or corrupt or callous or evil? And yet, history tells us and shows us that people do. It might help to know that Kellerman considers bad as being ineffective, meaning failing to produce the promised change, or unethical, or both. So that's how she defines bad. Interestingly, one of the ways she defines unethical is that a leader puts their own needs before their followers' needs. So she would say an ethical leader puts their followers' needs before their own needs. You can see why this book could be a little tricky. Kellerman definitely received some criticism for the book, but she accomplished part of what she hoped to, which was to increase the dialogue and the knowledge around what constitutes bad leadership. In the same year that her book came out, another book came out that went a little bit further. The title of that book was The Allure of Toxic Leaders: Why We Follow Destructive Bosses and Corrupt Politicians and How We Can Survive Them. This book was written by Jean Lippman-Blumen. She's a professor of public policy and organizational leadership at the Claremont Graduate University. One of the points she makes in her book is that toxic leaders wouldn't get very far without their followers' compliance. Leadership, in other words, does not exist by itself. A leader needs compliant followers in order to lead. So leadership is an interaction rather than an action, and followers share some of the blame for toxic leaders. We have to be careful with that, but this is what she says in her book. What's also true, according to her, is that followers who realize a leader is toxic often feel powerless to do anything to get rid of that leader. She says this: defining the toxic leader is tricky. Even leaders who are remembered as near saints sometimes behaved immorally or made bad decisions. Yet to be a truly toxic leader, one must consistently exhibit toxic traits and engage in dysfunctional behavior. Those traits and behavior patterns include lack of integrity and honesty, lying to followers to bolster a powerful vision, outsized ambition that puts the leader's quest for glory above the well-being of others, egotism and arrogance that foster incompetence and corruption, actions that intimidate, demoralize, demean, and marginalize others, breaching opponents' and followers' human rights and stifling criticism, holding tight to power by undermining potential successors. And it's worth saying that toxic leaders would never accept this description of themselves. Lippmann Blumen goes on to say that toxic leaders are able to tap into their followers' deep-seated psychological motivations. These are important. Toxic leaders typically exploit 4 basic needs and 2 primal fears. The needs are for authority, for security, to feel special, and to belong. The fears are ostracism and powerlessness. These gave me pause because most religions try to speak to these same things. She goes on to say that a toxic leader also knows that followers crave illusions, and so the leader must deliver a vision that captivates the follower and offer them a way to belong to something grand and beautiful or something inspiring. Again, that description gives me pause. The way to replace toxic leaders is to confront the fear of challenging a toxic leader, to strengthen democratic institutions, to demand that leaders are authentic, and demand leaders who won't spread false comfort, to give up the need to be special, to refuse a we-they dichotomy, and to intentionally develop the next generation of leaders. She says the best way to repel toxic leaders is to recruit non-toxic ones. Non-toxic leaders achieve and bestow freedom instead of spreading poison. After Wednesday's assault on the Capitol, we all have images that will remain with us. Because I am a Christian pastor, the images that are forever burned into my mind are the images of the white supremacist crowd carrying banners and other signs that proclaimed Trump, Jesus, and the Confederacy as though they all belonged together, which they do for some in that group. When I read Lippmann Blumen's explanation of leaders who need compliant followers, I really understood it. 74 million people voted for Trump in November, which means 74 million people were willing to follow him again or for the first time for another 4 years. That is staggering. As American Christians, we need to be asking why Christian people would be willing to follow anyone who is as antithetical to Jesus as someone can be. What have they been taught about Jesus? What have they been taught about means justifying the ends? What have they been taught about violence and nonviolence and where Jesus stands between those? There are so many questions like these that are swirling around in my head. Pastors like me all across our country would love to be preaching answers this morning. I have no answers, but I do have some reflections based on self-examination this week and from our congregational debrief call on Thursday morning. These reflections are a part of where I am today. I disagree with anyone who says this is not who we are as Americans. This is absolutely who we are, and the sooner we recognize that and name that, the sooner we can begin to work on systemic change. I live comfortably in a world that pits us against them. From the early days of my queer advocacy, and even before that, I have felt in a real and tangible way that those who are not for me are against me. I am not sure I know how to live with such complexity and paradox that I can refrain from making those who are on the other side my enemy. I personally engage in toxic leadership when I demean or marginalize the various white supremacist groups and right-wing Christians who follow the president. I don't know how to speak truth to power without marginalizing people in those groups. If any of you voted for the president, I confess I have not been a good pastor for you, and I am not sure I know how to be. I am willing to have conversations with you about why you voted the way you did, and even more willing to talk about how I can minister to and with you. As far as I know, I don't personally know anyone who was at the Capitol on Wednesday in the crowd. Rather than be glad, I am hearing that as an invitation to broaden my circles, or at least my circle of conversation partners. The more we shrink our circles, the more likely and willing we are to see those we don't know as both other and as less than. Shame is a very effective and powerful tool used by toxic people and toxic leaders. And I want to learn how to lead and live in the world without shaming myself or other people. White supremacy and Christian supremacy are alive and well, and on Wednesday they were on full display, even in their marriage, for all to see. Instead of minimizing the Christian part of me, or minimizing the white part of me, I need to maximize both in order to speak into the distorted gospel being preached and the transformation that is needed. I'm not perfect and I make mistakes. Is there a single person alive who doesn't have to learn on the job? I learn how to be a pastor as I go along, just as I learned how to be a parent as I went along. And mistakes have to be made in order for the learning to happen. Why would we think our leaders would be any different? Instead of shaming others for making mistakes, how can we speak to a mistake and extend an invitation to do something differently the next time? We're living in a call-out culture that I'm not sure is going to lead us into the transformation we need. Lastly, what does it mean to be called to be a prophetic church and also to be called to create a table of welcome for all people? How do those two calls live together. How do we manifest both as Jesus manifest both? My hope and prayer is that we can become a congregation who can learn how to live this paradox. Amen.